Tonight, we're continuing our exploration of how the 12 steps facilitate the achievement of emotional sobriety. The last several weeks, we've been digging into step 5. We admitted to ourselves, to another human being, and admitted to ourselves, to God, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. This is a critical step in terms of the achievement of emotional sobriety because it really helps us now start to learn the value of authenticity and vulnerability. And tonight, we are fortunate to have Dr. Michael McGee share his perspectives on this important step. Michael, I'll turn the meeting over to you. You're going to have to unmute and...
Thank you, Alan. Hi, everybody. It's good to be with you all again. I'd like to talk about taking the step 5 from an awakened perspective. That's been the theme of my talks up until now. To review, step 5 is that we admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. So let's first discuss what are these wrongs? Well, the dictionary definition of wrongs means unjust, dishonest, or immoral actions. I'd like to suggest that we define wrongs instead from an awakened perspective as actions that are harmful or unloving. And if we think about wrongs and dive into what are wrongs, I see there as being 3 categories of wrongs. There's wrongs of being, wrongs of seeing, and wrongs of doing. And I'd like to go through those. Let's first talk about the wrongs of being. The wrongs of being are the felt experience that's induced by trauma, including the trauma of the ego and general social trauma, as well as developmental trauma. It's a painful experience of our woundedness. It's an experience of separateness, brokenness, unworthiness, badness. It's the experience of an existential shame, the feeling that I am wrong. There's damage to our innate appreciation of the sacredness of existence. There's a feeling of being unlovable. One deeply wounded patient of mine summarized his wrong of being as, life sucks and I suck. I'm just living to die. And he was very, very traumatized. So the wrongs of being lead to the wrongs of seeing. And the wrongs of seeing are fundamental misunderstandings. I think of them as trauma-induced mental misprogrammings, and they include the delusion of judgments, that we, others, our circumstances, or what happened to us are good or bad, as opposed to harmful or beneficial. And then there's the delusion, the wrong of separateness. It's me against the world. I'm all alone in this. And then there's the delusion of unlovability. As I've said before, we believe what we receive. The core belief that I am unlovable because others were unable to love us as we are. As Alan says, what we are most wrong about is how wrong we've been about ourselves. And because we feel so unlovable and it feels so real, we believe it is true. And then there's a misunderstanding that I am what I do. This is a conflation of who you are with what you've done. And then there's the delusion of conditionality. It needs to be this way to be okay. As Alan says, the big lie. I must do things to be worthy. My worthiness is conditional. Having the delusion that I must be someone I am not to be lovable and loved. And then there's the delusion or the wrong of uniqueness. We uniquely don't belong and we are uniquely deficient. And then there's the delusion of agency. It's my fault that people don't love me. I'm not loved for who I am, and that is my deficiency. It's not their deficiency in their capacity to love. And then there's the delusion of culpability. It's my fault people hurt me. This gives me the illusion that I have control over my trauma. And then there's the delusion of intentions. These are unwholesome motivations based on the delusion that we can become worthy by virtue of our good actions. And then there's the delusional belief that pain is bad. We should be comfortable all the time. I must do anything I can to avoid pain, especially the pain of my loved wound. And then there's the delusion of purpose, that life is about maximizing pleasure and our ego assets including wealth, status, and power. And then there's the delusion that it feels good, that if it feels good, it must always be good. And then there's the delusion that what people think of me must be true, that I should take other people's judgments of me personally. And finally, there's the delusion of hopelessness, that our self-perpetuating negative convictions about ourselves that perpetuate our negative circumstances. So those are the wrongs of being and seeing, which lead then to also the wrongs of what we didn't see. Not only the wrongs that we saw, but also the wrongs that we didn't see. And these are the realities of the universe that we didn't see in an unawakened state. And those include not seeing that the essence of almost all actions is love. It is either skillful or unskillful. There's either net benefit or net harm. Behind hatred, there is a disguised, poisoned, and distorted loving intent. It is not seeing the hidden loving intent behind our own destructive actions. It's also not seeing other people's ignorance and woundedness as the reason for their neglect or harm of us. It's not seeing how we were infected by hate when we didn't meet other people's expectations and demands or standards. It's not seeing our interconnectedness. It's not seeing the love and goodness that has supported and sustained us to this point. It's not seeing the sacred. This is a failure of awe, a failure to appreciate the miracle of existence. There's not seeing our love wound and that unconsciously sets our life agenda to heal that wound through the love and validation of others. And then there's not seeing our innate goodness and the innate goodness of others. So finally, these wrongs of being and seeing or not seeing arise in the wrongs of doing. And these include the harm that we've done, how we've wounded ourselves and others, and both are equally important. There's the controlling, the lying, the judging, the manipulating, the falseness. There's infecting others with our own judgmental hatred. There's being neglectful or indifferent to ourselves or others. There's avoiding, addicting, numbing, distracting, doing everything we can to avoid looking directly into our pain, especially into our love wound. There's making demands of others, demands of being accepted, loved, valued, cared for, burdening others, exerting unenforceable rules, like Alan says. So naming what's wrong, also, I think what's important in this step that is neglected is that when we name what's wrong, we're also inherently also revealing what is right. There's wrongs of being, seeing, and doing, and then there's rights being, seeing, and doing. And these are implied in the fifth step. You can't separate the rights from the wrongs. When you do step 4 and step 5, you discern what's right at the same time as you discern what's wrong. So we could add to step 5, admitting to God, to ourselves, and to others the exact nature of what is right. So let's briefly review some of what is right from an awakened perspective. Most of these are the opposite of our wrongs. To begin, there's right being. There is loving awareness or reverent presence. There is the experience of oneness and wholeness and goodness and sacredness and reverence. And from reverence arises the 4, what are called in Buddhism, the paramitas, or the Brahma Viharas, of joy, compassion, kindness, and equanimity. And from right being comes right seeing, which includes seeing our interconnection and our interdependence, discerning the difference between harm and benefit in place of judgments of good and bad, seeing how ignorance and pain perpetuate ignorance and pain, how trauma begets trauma, and how hate begets hate. To see what is beneficial, what are wholesome motivations, to see right intent as to benefit versus to become lovable or loved, to separate who we are from what we've done, to see everyone's innate goodness, to see the workings of ego, woundedness, fear, pain, selfishness, and how these are universally enacted in often tragic dramas of human existence. And it's to have wisdom. It's seeing what's going on and what to do about it, and seeing the answer to the question, what would love do? It's seeing the value of pain and discomfort, that when investigated and processed properly, pain yields our greatest gifts. It's seeing guidelines for wholesome action versus rigid rules for how I and others must be. It's seeing there is no need for fear of who we are. It's seeing the purpose of life, to love and to enjoy this life, and to see the primacy of love. And it's seeing awe. It's seeing the extraordinary in the ordinary. It's seeing the miraculous in the mundane. And then from right being and seeing leads to right doing. In other words, to live, for example, a balanced life of work, love, play, and self-care, enjoying and nurturing life, living with integrity, not harming, acting wisely, practicing presence and inquiry, practicing appreciation, renouncing of judgment of what I call gooding and badding, or seeing that when it arises, letting it fall away, acting with authenticity, with appropriate transparency, and I'll talk more about that in a second, practicing connection and intimacy, and really importantly, being our own ideal parents and beginning a process of reparenting ourselves, tending to our lives and to our love wounds with a love which is more perfect than the love that we received. And living a life of love, loving ourselves and others fully, wholeheartedly, and perhaps the greatest challenge, unconditionally. So these are the exact nature of our rights of being, seeing, and doing that we want to know and share with others as we continue to live steps 4 and 5 and eventually step 10. Now I'd like to expand on Ellen and Thom's comments on the enlightened witnesses with whom we share our step 5. Enlightened witnesses, enlightened is defined in the dictionary as free from ignorance and misinformation, fully comprehending or understanding. For me, I like the idea of an enlightened witness being thought of as a loving witness. They are unconditionally loving. They may say, that was a pretty fucked up thing you did, but I love you, I value you, I accept you, and I don't judge you. An enlightened witness has transcended judgment and passed over to discernment. This models for us how to be with ourselves in this judging world. You might call an enlightened witness a transitional love model. They call you out on your unskillful ways of being, seeing, and doing with kindness and non-judgment. They also help you to look at what you might not see. Look here. What do you think about this? They're a kind co-investigator. I did this recently with a colleague last week who was feeling resentful about helping her sister find a place to live. And as we looked at this, what came up was a sense of obligation and guilt that my colleague felt because she had done so much better in life than her sister. And she saw that finding her sister a place to live, in trying to do that for her, she was perpetuating her sister's sense of being inferior to her, which was quite an awakening for her. So I'd like to talk now about the part of step 5 about admitting to God and to oneself that goes before admitting to another person. Up until now, we've talked about admitting our wrongs to another person. There's almost nothing written that I could find on admitting our wrongs to God and to ourselves. In my experience, the transcendent self or the true self or the universal self are indistinct from what I experience as God. Admitting our wrongs to the sacred is preparation for admitting them to another human being. In awakened stillness, we experience our own non-judgment and reverence grounded in our divine essence. In deep prayer or meditation with the sacred, we experience being with our seeing in stillness and experience that all is well. We experience that we are loved by the divine. We sense that the essence of all is love. I am loved. All is forgiven. This is a universal experience of all who commune with God or the sacred. It creates a point of reference and refuge for when we take the courageous risk of sharing our step 5 with an imperfect human being. Now, for admitting your wrongs to yourself, I recommend reading your step 4 into a mirror. As you read it, show yourself understanding, kindness, compassion, and forgiveness. There are several characteristics of step 5 that I'd just like to briefly touch on. Step 5 is an act of compassion for ourselves, to hold our wrongs without shame. Step 5 is an act of courage, to risk the judgments and rejections of others, to firmly do what is right despite fear, to accept that we may be judged or rejected, to be and say who we are despite the risks. Step 5 is an act of connection, to come out of secrecy into authenticity, to discover we are not alone in our ignorance, our woundedness, and our imperfection. Step 5 is an act of conviction, a conviction that to live an authentic life rooted in our innate goodness is correct. I can speak the truth and it will not destroy me. Step 5 is a commitment to living with authenticity, appropriate transparency, and unconditionality. This includes unconditional reverence for ourselves and others. Step 5 is a commitment to the truth of our innate lovability. Step 5 is a commitment to the truth that if you can't love me, that is your limitation. Step 5 is an act of acceptance. With step 5, we begin to live our self-acceptance, and living self-acceptance promotes the acceptance of others. Step 5 is an act of forgiveness. Forgiving ourselves enables us to better forgive others. Step 5 is an act of love. Step 5 benefits us. It's healing and liberating. It is loving ourselves exactly for who we are that enables us to love others for exactly who they are. Authentic connection and transparency inspire reverence of others for us because we are real. Step 5 is an act of humility. When we share our wounded humanity with another, we realize we are just another insignificant, sacred, fucked up, beautiful bozo on the bus. Nobody's special and yet sacred, just like everybody else. Finally, step 5 is an opportunity to tell a new story or narrative of our lives. The challenge of step 5 is to tell a story that's accurate, insightful, accountable, compassionate, forgiving, and hopeful. It's the story of a survivor and a thriver, and not of a hopeless victim. So what about after step 5, as we continue to live step 4 and 5 in the form of step 10? Doing step 5 begins a lifelong process of continuing to live step 4 and 5. This is a life of no shame, a life of self-acceptance. We practice seeing ourselves through understanding, compassionate, and non-judging eyes. And this sets the foundation for seeing others with understanding, compassion, and non-judging eyes. For many of us, step 5 is a progressive practice. We may take small steps of progressive transparency. We do this with a sponsor or a therapist or enlightened friends. Step 5 is often linked with step 4 and step 10 in a lifelong spiral of inquiry, discovery, and disclosure. There's a need for caution and discernment at times. You might not want to do your step 5 with your boss or someone who hates you. Step 5 can either be a leap of faith or small steps of faith. Trust is critically important to step 5. I trust that I can tell you the terrible things I've done, and you will not consider me to be terrible. Excuse me. Step 4 and 5 are an endless deepening of being, seeing, and doing. We practice authenticity with appropriate transparency. Our transparency depends on the degree of intimacy and the context. The experience of being transparent and accepted is profoundly healing. It is a liberation from secrecy and hiding. With time and growth, we find ourselves able to more and more be transparent in situations that are less intimate. We become capable of utilizing self-disclosure in the service of benefiting others. As an example of that, I'll share something that I did this last Saturday with a patient that I would never have done 20 years ago. He was talking about his son, and his son's wife had cheated on him, was having an affair. And he and his wife were so angry at her, who had cheated on their son. And they were so harsh and judgmental. And I told them that I had cheated on my second wife, and that it was a time from something that people feel terrible shame about. And that stopped my patient dead in his tracks. and his wife. And really, it caused them to pause and did exactly what I wanted it to do, which was to put them in terrible conflict about judging and hating their daughter-in-law. It was really quite effective. So this is where transparency, I think, can be a loving act in the appropriate situation. Regarding step 5 in emotional sobriety, the key is this: letting go of dependency, that people, places, or things needing to be a certain way to feel lovable, but also letting go of a dependency that we need to be a certain way to be lovable. When you are rooted in the sacred, you know your essential lovability even when no one loves you. You not only liberate yourself from dependency on other people's love, you also liberate others from having to love you or do it or say anything to you to be okay. You unburden people of an obligation that it's not theirs to take on. Then you can love freely, and freely given, and love is freely received. Finally, in going beyond step 5, we want to fill our lives with loving, enlightened witnesses. We want to create a tribe where we can be safely authentic and transparent, where we can engage in the practice of loving and being loved unconditionally. 20 minutes and 28 seconds.
Look at that. He was going for it that time. He's timed himself. Everybody doesn't know about how bad you felt about when you went over last time. You felt so bad.
I felt unlovable.
You felt unlovable and like you violated the unwritten law that somehow you should only do 20 minutes. But I appreciate you being aware of that. That's great.
I'm concerned about the 28 seconds. I don't get that.
Well, there's always one in the crowd, Michael. What do we have to say? See, I was going to say, you don't want to have too many enlightened witnesses around. Then you have nothing to practice emotional sobriety on.
Exactly.
So you need to have your Thom Rutledges in the room as well. So that
I'm here to help, buddy.
You see, there are gurus. They really help us.
Thank you, Thom. Appreciate that.
Hey, Michael.
All right, Thom, you and I, we're going to give ourselves just 3 minutes so everybody else can share on this one. So
good idea. Yeah.
First 3 minutes or the second?
I'll just go right now because I don't know if I even have 3 minutes, but I probably do. Just a couple of things just popped out as Michael was talking, and I love the idea. First of all, I love his, I can never rhyme like he can. And I'm just, I'm working on it. But I love the idea of good versus bad becomes harmful versus beneficial, that thing, because and I love that idea that this is something I've learned from you and from Michael during this conversation about the 5th step that we've been having. I love the idea that the exact nature of wrongs in 5th step has never brought this to mind until now for me, but that it takes me to that place that is one of mine and your favorite places, which is process. The exact nature of our wrongs is not just a list, because initially we just think of a list of bad shit we've done. It's like, we're way beyond that. It's like this is understanding ourselves. And when we're really looking at how to deal with ourselves as organic rather than static. And it's not just the confessional. And it's not just admitting and getting clear of this confession. It is understanding the nature of understanding ourselves better so that we can continue to grow. And then one thing I put here was the nature of our wrongs. I can't remember what it was Michael was saying when I wrote this down, but it was inspired by him. Nature of our wrongs, the exact nature of our wrongs emerge from our attempts to make what feels wrong right. So all the ways that I have tried to do, that basically I'm fessing up to in my 5th step, are shit that I was trying to do right the first time. I was trying to figure it out. I mean, some of the craziest, dumbest, alcoholic or whatever asshole stuff I've done has been an unconscious attempt, and sometimes conscious, but a lot of it is an unconscious attempt to make something right. Yeah. And getting to that place brings us back to forgiveness. And I love that. And I've shared with you that in my second book that I ever wrote, I wrote a little thing about forgiveness that I'm sure I didn't understand at the time, but forgiveness is not something we do. It's our natural state when we're not holding on to old pain. And that's what a lot of this stuff is about. It's about releasing the truth. Truth sets us free. I bet I did 3 minutes.
That's a great 3 minutes.
Thank you.
So, a couple different things come to mind, because if we stay focused on the emotional sobriety issue here, which is our focus on how these steps help us achieve, I think it's so important to think about that my putting the curse of perfection on myself and others is also a part of where I've been wrong, where I've been harmful to myself. And it's so important as we talk about these things. And that's, I sat here because when Michael's talking about this incredible vision he has, the word keeps coming to my mind. What in order? I can't go through with it. What in order? I can't go through with it, because it's such to me, an idealistic thing, which I think is great. That's why I love to have you here, because there's a certain vision that you have of this that to me is so powerful, Michael. Where I come from with that is I can see that, but I'm not going to judge myself by that. Now, I hope that makes sense to you guys, is that for me, the struggle is trying to be what this guy Joe C said, sober enough, or emotionally sober enough, which is maybe 2 out of 5 times I get it right. Like, can that be okay, right? I mean, can I just accept that that's part of my evolution here, is not to get all this stuff right, but to be striving, right, for what Bill called, we strive for spiritual progress, not spiritual perfection. But if you're like me, you convert that really quickly into we strive for spiritual perfection, and that somehow progress and perfection get fused in our minds. See, I fuse shit like that all the time. Like I fuse love and dependency. I fuse progress and perfection. I fuse idealism as a should that I should live up to. And see, these are the things that I think are so important for me to guard against in my life, because I will take stuff like this and run with it in a terrible way. Or in another way, I'll use stuff like that to just say, all right, well, now it's just a matter of me loving myself and I don't have to do the work. Well, that's not what Michael is saying. If you know what Michael's saying at all, I mean, if you understand what he's saying when he shares about his trauma, he's worked hard on his trauma. And this is the result of that work, just like emotional sobriety was the result of the work that Bill Wilson did on trying to understand what the hell is causing this terrible depression that's crippling me, that makes me before drink and now makes me not want to get out of bed. And see, I just think that keeping this in mind all the time, when any one of us, I share, Thom shares, or whatever, what we're looking for here is to find a way to live a good enough life, right? Good enough, sober enough. That has nothing to do with perfection. And I love just the final thought I had. I've always loved the work of Dr. Nathaniel Branden. And if you haven't read Dr. Branden's work, I would recommend you reading any one of his books, because they're just filled with a lot of gems. We've had a lot of insight into self-esteem, especially. And Thom, and I love that little page. I mean, at some point, maybe in the break after the meeting, you can read that page that you showed me.
Oh, the one that keeps showing up in the book I wrote in 1989. I know.
I love that one. I mean, I think that page is so great. But what Dr. Branden says, he says, do not confuse self-acceptance with passivity. See, acceptance has nothing to do with passivity. It's a very, very active experience in terms of coming to acceptance. And when I accept myself, it doesn't mean that I stop striving to move forward. It just means I recognize this is where I am at this particular moment in time, and that I'm going to accept this as my starting point.
But Alan, this is exactly that is right on with what you say so well and so timely when it needs to be said, which is about next. It's like acceptance, self-acceptance brings us to next. It's about movement and not passivity. It's like, actually, out of that same book, I had the thing in there that said, practice accepting exactly who you are every single day of your life, and you'll never stop changing. Yeah. And it's like the idea is acceptance keeps us moving forward.